She's our first Indian origin scientist presenting, and furthermore, a woman. And so I think this combination is quite exceptional, and thank you very much for being with us today.
Wow. And I didn't even choose either of those. Hello, Your Holiness. It's a great joy to be here, and in fact, in many ways, a dream come true to be presenting this research to you in the country I was born in. What I'd like to share with you today is the work that we have been doing in my laboratory, investigating attention, and in particular, how training using mindfulness-based techniques might actually change attention. We have been studying this in people that really rely on their attention quite a bit. These are medical and nursing students who are experiencing a lot of stress, but at the same time, really need to make sure that they don't have any attentional lapses. If they do, it could be very difficult. So the training techniques that we've been using are similar to the program that John Kabat-Zinn has created, an 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction type of a program. You want to adjust the mic? Yeah. Okay. Is this better? Okay, how's that? Yeah, okay. And so what I'd like to share with you today are some of those results. But I wanted to say at the outset that I have, in the work that I do and the background that I have, chosen to emphasize attention and working memory as the two main things I'm going to be investigating. But I want to make clear that that in no way is trying to say that those are the only qualities that are actually changing as a function of this training. So I wanted to just say that from the beginning. And as I've been going about trying to determine how to investigate these functions and how meditation or mindfulness training might change them, I wanted to make clear what my intentions are in doing this. Part of it is really to address a big, important part of being a human being, which is how can we work to improve the well-being of our fellow humans and reduce suffering. And it ends up that attention and working memory are both very easily degraded. They're very fragile capacities. They are degraded when we have emotional disturbances, when we have disease states like ADHD, which was mentioned by Adele earlier today, when we're under stress.
Attention, working memory.
And the other way in which it's degraded is something all of us will hopefully have to face, part of normal healthy aging. So understanding ways in which we might be able to improve these operations would be helpful for many different contexts. At the same time, I'm a very curious scientist and want to understand better the nature of the mind. And how is it that attention and working memory might actually be trainable? What aspects can be changed? What aspects cannot? And how, importantly for my interests, is how do these changes look in the brain? What aspects of the brain can index to us what's changing? So I have been, in establishing the hypotheses I want to test, looking at two main sources of information. One is the growing literature on training techniques in novices like mindfulness-based stress reduction, and the other is the classical texts and classical information we have from Buddhist science. So Alan and Rupert both mentioned some of these concepts already. Alan described mindfulness as the faculty of sustaining voluntary attention continuously upon a familiar object without forgetfulness or distraction. And I thought it was very interesting that these concepts, attention, doing it continuously, not getting distracted, are the same things that we deal with in my laboratory in the tasks that we develop. At the same time, Rupert mentioned two concepts that I think are very much tied to the way in which we might go about picking our experiments. One was manasikara, or turning the mind toward. And the second is smriti or sati, which has been described as remembering, taking hold, not losing the object. One way that I've been thinking about these two concepts is perhaps they're tied to our cognitive neuroscience views of attention and working memory. So that's what I'd like to tell you about. Just to give you a little overview of what I'd like to cover, I think it would be useful for us to talk a little bit about the components of attention and the way that we have conceptualized them through cognitive neuroscience models, and then get into the experiments that I've conducted looking at how attention might actually be altered with these training techniques in novices, as well as looking at how mindfulness training might improve working memory in both young adults and older adults who we know actually have degraded functioning as we age. And just because it's late in the afternoon and you've been up since 3:30 in the morning, I thought it would be a good idea to just say the conclusions right now, which are that mindfulness training we don't know. Mindfulness training we are finding improves orienting, which I'll describe in a minute, and executive control, which Adele described this morning. And the second thing is that we're finding in our initial studies that mindfulness training is a beneficial training strategy in both young and older adults. So let's begin by just talking about the components of attention. And I have these sort of metaphors up here, really, to describe three systems of attention that have been investigated for many years within the cognitive neuroscience literature. And we've already heard from Anne and from Dave Meyer about aspects, and Adele about aspects of these. But I want to just try to tie it all together, at least in the way that I've been thinking about it. So one important aspect of attention we can think of as similar to a flashlight, that it shines on the particular object or even concept, if we shine it within our minds, that we find to be most relevant in the moment. And it has many features that we could consider to be similar. It can be sharp, it can be broad. And the thing about it is that you can shine it on many different kinds of information, whether that's concepts, sensory experiences, memories, or emotions. So the flashlight can be used for many things. Another aspect of attention is described by this cartoon man, which is really a juggler that has many things up in the air that the juggler is trying to manage.
Executive control 당선 신이디. 배는 매직 자라만 보시부지 대비리야. 라바냐고 되고 장마냐도 되고 직가신 남을 유지대지로 주도해르지.
Right, and Adele did a nice job, I think, this morning describing to us the features of inhibition and cognitive flexibility that are important for executive control as we try to figure out in the moment what's not only the most important thing for us to do, but how should we respond or behave appropriately given our priorities of what to do. And the final system of attention that I'll describe is called the alerting system, which is really like thinking about keeping the attention in a readied state, like a flashing yellow light, where we don't know exactly what the relevant thing is that we should be attending to, but we know that we need to have ready access, immediate access of our attention in any moment. So in addition to just helping us understand how these systems function, these metaphors can be useful in understanding how attention can be problematic. So for example, in disorders like depression, we can think of a flashlight really only being able to shine on negative thoughts, depressing thoughts. Or in a disorder of attention like attention deficit disorder, we can think of a juggler that always wants to have balls in the air. Or something like anxiety or stress as a situation where our alerting system is always seeing warning lights everywhere. So I think that these are useful analogies, and what I'd like to do now is actually describe to you how we examine these in the laboratory. So what tasks do we have people engage in to get a little bit more specific about not only these systems, but the sub-processes within these. So to begin, the orienting system. This is just an example of what you might see if I were to ask you to come into the laboratory to see how the functioning of your orienting system works. And your job as the subject, is to just gently rest your eyes on that central cross and to then wait for a attention directing cue. And the cue now is really symbol.
symbol.
So like this. So the arrow says, now move your attention. Keep your eyes on the cross, but move your attention to the location that the arrow is pointing, right? Then, after you've done that, you're maintaining your attention in the position that the cue directed you to. And then your job is to determine if a target, which is either an X or an O, you just have to press a button to say X in one case, O in the other. And that's the experiment. So how is this useful in understanding orienting? Well, we can manipulate different aspects, different relationships between where the target appears and where I'm asking you to direct your attention to figure out the different components of the system. That's just what I'm describing here. So this is the same set of slides, just now in the order that the subject might experience it. You see the two boxes, you get ready, keep your eyes gently on the fixation cross, you move your attention to the direction of the arrow, you actually engage your attention at that position, and then you wait for the target to appear and then respond. Now that's a condition in which I have appropriately directed you to the location that the target will appear at. Right? So you move your attention and the target actually appears there. But we also have conditions in which we don't do that. So I would ask you to move your attention to a location. You trust that the arrow is correct, and I organize the probability so that in most cases it is correct. You engage your attention there, but now, because the X did not appear there, there's two other processes that you need to engage in. Well, that you have to perform. You have to disengage your attention and actually move it to the location. So these types of very simple, but I would argue in many ways elegant experiments allow us to decompose attentional orienting into the sub-processes of engagement, movement, disengagement. And in the studies that people have done using these different tasks, we find that there's very specific patterns of responses that we see that give us a good idea of if they're properly doing the task or not. So when the arrow is actually correctly directing you to the location of the X, we just call that a validly cued target. So that's when you were validly allowed to go to the location and the target appears. And then when it doesn't, we describe that as an invalidly cued target. And what we see, which is very interesting and a good signature for us,
다당보다 시샤지전 X 텔레그와 다디 valid turn the merge 다디 쇼이엘 미다세 다당 샤바 간시질이야 X 순환원도 쇼연 레비나 다양 고백에 다당보다 turn 맞은 버와 invalid
주신이도 말해
주신이들이나
아니 샴딘 주시강 집을 주시지나
So but the lower one still has the X in the same boxes. So it's on the either side of the X you're talking about. Either side of the cross.
It will be on either side of the cross, right? So you can have the X. The X will only appear. I'm sorry.
So how would that be invalid? Because the arrow is only pointing to the box.
Okay. Well, what? Okay. So. Well, the boxes are just indicating the two potential locations that the target could appear at, only on the right or only on the left. When you get the arrow, you move your attention to the one potential location. The target appears there, that's a valid target. When you move your attention to one location and the target doesn't appear there, that's an invalid. And across all the different trials, we might have it pointing left or right, have the X or an O appear, and we mix them all up. So that's what I'm describing as invalid. You get the arrow points you to a direction, leads you to a location, but then the target doesn't appear there. So in that case, you have to disengage your attention from where you had engaged it, led by the cue, and move it to the location of the where you actually see this flash to determine if it's an X or an O. Okay? And in that sense, what you're doing is essentially preparing your mind or turning your mind toward the location that the arrow directs you to. What happens when people do these experiments is that they take much longer to respond when the target was invalidly cued versus when it was validly cued, which would make sense because your attention actually, in one case, in the valid case, was prepared at the location, and in the other case, not. So this is just a way to describe how we index the orienting system. And as I said before, these components of engage, disengage, move have been studied quite a lot in functional imaging studies to determine what the neural circuitry is that supports these individual operations. And in addition to finding that there's specific regions that get activated, we find that if patients have damage in these particular regions, they have difficulty with those things. So, for example, people that have damage to the parietal cortex, this temporal parietal junction and other regions, have difficulty with disengaging. So if they move to a location that the arrow guides them to, they can never take their attention away to move it to the correct position when the target appears.
내가 대화를 들으셔. 근데 attention 기 자세도 기주로 숨체. 단 really 낭생이야. 기주면만 보여 그래서 배나 로유를 줘봐다. 내내 추 보고 요보다. 보여주고니 미국 신다실 때고 요. 되게
뭐야스게 얼마들이. 미국의 예지는 거 텔레비전 로고 예로. 미국 수도 세는 술랭으로.
술랭으로. 다가 이는 다당사디 대용을 돈도 제로. 다들 ang사지 다디제서 대치 대위원자. 그러니까 So really we are talking about the engagement of attention at the level of thought, because at the perceptual level, everything is being seen, what is in front of you. So this, because even whether it is the cues on the right side or left side, wherever the X appears, the visual perceptions perceives them anyway. Mm-hmm. So so the disengagement and engagement and moving can only make sense at the level of thought.
No, these are. You're correct. Yes, when the X appears, our visual system does notice it, and that's how we're able to then redirect our attention to that position. The differences that we see between how quickly we're able to respond when it appears at the location of attention in the valid case versus not suggests to us that this process of paying attention beforehand is actually helpful and is happening in preparation for the stimulus that will appear. So the example that I showed you was simply with pressing a button. But if we had people do this while we were recording their brain activity, we would find that the parts of the visual system that represent the side that the arrow pointed to would start becoming more active even before anything appeared there. And as soon as it appears there, then you get a really big benefit. So I'd like to move on now to the second system to give us an example of how we might index executive control. And it's very similar to what Adele described this morning. There are ways in which we behave that seem sort of habitual, that we want to behave in a specific way because of our kind of disposition or the way the system is created. She mentioned where you'd have hearts and flowers, and when we see a stimulus, we want to respond on that side. The experiment that we use is similar to that, and in fact, the experiments that she already described could be used as other indices of executive control. This is called a flanker task. And in this task, your job as the subject is simply to determine if that middle arrow in this series of arrows is pointing left or right. That's the one that has the line underneath it. And what we do to make this a little bit more difficult is we surround it by these other arrows. And these are the flankers. These are the flanking arrows. And these flankers can either point in the same direction as the central arrow, and that's what I've described here, or the other direction. And what we find is that it's much easier, and you're much more easily able to and much quicker to determine the direction of that middle arrow when all of the arrows are pointing in the same direction. Versus...
yellow choto, that yellow choto, yun choto, sketch theatre to tear with the yun and Damambush Juche, flankers left to chow yun juberch. Erosion that gilly pasan jab jushavena, that erotama, that's how much chochil cacho and key the choka choto slamna, labdeores, that
So in many ways, it's similar to what Adele was mentioning, that we might have this natural inclination to press one button, but we have to not do that in the context of when the arrows are not pointing in the same direction as the central arrow. And that takes us a little bit of time. So we see that this is just now, if we think of this as the number of milliseconds it might take you, or seconds it might take you to respond, you're slower when it's incongruent, when the flankers are in the other direction, relative to when they're all in the same direction. So in this case, we're not turning our mind toward a particular spatial location, but we really are trying to make sure we respond appropriately for just that middle arrow. So they share, orienting and executive control in some sense share features of selection, but the level of selection is different. In one case, it's prior to the stimulus appearing, and in the other case, it's after it appears, we decide the appropriate response. So the final system that I'd like to just share with you is the alerting system. And the way that we index this system is similar to the other two. We use very similar paradigms to the orienting system. And essentially what we do is you'd have the same sort of situation, rest your eyes on that cross, but this time I don't prepare you in any way for where the X or the O might appear. I simply wait. You just, as the subject, you'd simply wait for an X or O to appear, and then you'd press a button. And you'd compare that to situations where you would get just a big flash or something that would say, okay, get ready, something's about to happen. But you'd have no information about where on the screen the information might happen. So unlike the orienting task, in this case, your job is to just have attention ready to be used without knowing exactly where. So this would be similar to the kind of vigilance that one might need to have in order to prepare your mind. And in the first experiment that I'd like to tell you about, our intention was to just start very broad. Which of these three systems might be sensitive to mindfulness training in young individuals between 25 and 30 that had no experience with any kind of mindfulness practices? And as I mentioned, these were nursing and medical students that really wanted to keep their attention in the top shape as they could. So what we did is we actually used an experiment that allowed us to index all three systems in one. And the details aren't all that important, except to say that it was organized in the same fashion. You'd have a cue, and then you'd have a target, and in some cases the target was this arrows pointing in the same direction or not. And by specific comparisons, we could index how these orienting, executive control, and alerting systems might be functioning. So what we did is we compared individuals that took the course with individuals that were matched for age and education and everything else, and compared their performance twice, once before and once after 8 weeks had passed. The group that received the training obviously got the training during that 8 weeks. And what we found was that of these three systems, the system that showed the biggest sensitivity to training was the orienting system. So that's what I'm showing you here. And if you remember to the graph I showed previously, we've got, if you have not correct information, or in this case, no information, you're slower. This is just responses. You're slower than when you get correct information about where the target will appear. Without any training, we found that they were able to do it more quickly than if they received no information. But with training, they were very efficient and quick at getting to the location of the target.
말에 단디 대만이샤 소리 대만이샤 시샤 지지 드니 단 드다게 드니 스테월 다데 진년잖아 또 셈미고 다단 저봐 다단 attention 자시로 숨체송 계주 숨은 안에 찍대 앙사진데 되제 찍대야 the executive control 구도네 자와카를 중마주 당진체 되제 찍대 아니 유미고 다단데 다데 숨은 안에 유미고 때야 되려 계주들이야 자세들이야 아니 대만이 장고에 인기 쇼견심부터샤스.
So just to say a few words about the training itself, it was this 8-week course, very similar to John Kabat-Zinn's program. And the main types of practices that they were learning as novices had to do with developing concentrative attention. So breath, focusing on the sensations of breathing, or body scan, or walking meditation, where there was always a big distinction between, during the context of practice itself, between what was the relevant target of the practice and everything else that you shouldn't be paying attention to. Yeah. So this training did not emphasize a lot of broadening or opening of attention. And we find that in the visual experiment that we did, where it was about getting to the location, they were more efficient. Other people have done studies in, again, novices, where they find something very similar, not in the orienting component, but in the executive control component. So that, again, if it's being specific, do this, respond to this target, not these flankers, you see benefits. So both orienting and executive control, these two systems that are sensitive to mindfulness training in novices, share the feature of involving selective attention, which is what Anne was also referring to yesterday. And selective attention allows for preferential processing of information that we consider to be relevant while ignoring irrelevant information. So there's a high, the distinction between what is relevant and irrelevant is very large. In the case of orienting, it was the spatial position. In the case of executive control, what direction only the central arrow is pointing.
So what do you mean by relevant versus irrelevant here?
Right.
I mean, is it objectively, or is it from the kind of value judgment of the person?
Relevant in this case, to be extremely explicit, is just in the context of being the subject in the experiment. So you as the experimenter define what is important for you to do in this time, and you're able to do it versus...
the experimentation experimentation because could experiment the charger that couldn't do you but the mebak. Couldn't do me the imambu nami che corona me with the days. No, to done do you my sure. Yesterday we had some discussions about how habituation leads to a greater speed in the pointing, focusing on a particular direction. This has nothing to do with this idea of relevance and irrelevance here.
It would if you have to overcome your tendency in order to perform the task that you're asked to perform. In that case, it would take you longer. So relevant and irrelevant in the context here is just a kind of a neutral term to say in the context of what either somebody else or you decide is important to do in this moment. So for example, in the context of breath awareness practice, I'm deciding the relevant stimulus is the breath and not the birds, the sounds of the birds. So this concept came up yesterday too, that attention is a system that we use for many different things. Just as I mentioned, that flashlight of orienting could be used for many kinds of things to shine your attention upon. Here what I'm showing is that attention can be used in the context of our experiments, as I've just shown you, to deal with stimuli in the external landscape, little flashes of light or arrows. But all of this is also happening within what I would describe as the internal landscape, which is not present in the environment. So thoughts, feelings, emotions, our thoughts about our thoughts, or metacognition. And what we've shown in the first studies that I just described is that mindfulness training in novices improved orienting, and in other people's studies have also been shown to improve executive functions, which share this feature of selecting one thing and not getting distracted by other things. So the question for me was, well, what about within the internal environment? Is it possible that mindfulness training also improves our ability to select what's relevant in the moment from the internal landscape? So here's an example of children playing football, and orienting would be knowing exactly that the ball is the relevant stimulus, within the external landscape, but in the internal landscape, it would be knowing which goal is the appropriate goal for your team. That's what I would describe as holding that information in some kind of form so that it's readily accessible. And we can think of that as working memory or short-term memory, and we can talk about the distinctions between those two later. But for the purposes of right now, the important question in my mind was, can you select better what is held in the internal landscape in the same way that we see benefits in the external landscape? So this concept of selecting from the internal landscape
단한테 몰아서는 잡아주지 지고래서 저는 볼레제베 가려야 그래 조카와 방구에 메디게 되다 그 템벌은 냐지 근데 배주지고.
This concept of selection within internal representations is very similar to selective attention as I just described to you. We call this working memory, as Adele mentioned earlier today. And here it allows internal representations of relevant information to be maintained and manipulated over very short periods of time without getting distracted by irrelevant information. So again, this distinction between, in the particular context, what is important or relevant and what's not is held. But this time, it's about within your own mind holding the representation and doing something with it in many cases to actively protect it from getting distracted. I'm not going to say much about this, but I wanted to bring it up now, and Liz will talk about this tomorrow, is that these processes of selective attention and working memory, which I've described in these experiments that seem very non-emotional, flashes of lights and arrows are non-emotional, but these two same systems work together to regulate many different kinds of information, including our thoughts and emotions and behavior. So they're incredibly important, and if we could figure out a way in which to improve these functions, it would be very, very useful for many people.
더 연구해서 근데 그 배제 제작이 mikbalaya 아니 친구가 좀 말해서 나한테 영화 멍부실이 되거든. 근데 내가 또 내 emotion 당선지 단다 멍부실이야. 근데 attention 되게 누가 되게 제 여러 단도배나 아니 당선지 단다 고 들이야.
So what I would like to do next is describe to you an experiment that we have used, and that many people have used types of experiments like these to index working memory. And in this experiment, again, it's a very simple experiment, but I think it allows us to do something similar to the orienting experiment I described. Take these complex interrelated components and separate them out to determine what aspect might be getting improved with training. So in this experiment, your job as the subject is to remember a face. And we try to remove everything in the face as much as possible that you could easily use some other strategy other than just the perception of the face. So no features that would be easily verbalizable. And what you see on the screen is just the face, and then you'd see nothing for some period of time, and then you'd see a second face. And your job is to determine if that second face was the face you were holding in your mind. So if you think about the parallel, which is the bottom row, in the mind, what we think is happening, and in fact we've got brain signatures that support this, once you see the face, it's perceived and then held in your working memory, and then it is actually being held throughout the entire period of time when nothing is on the screen. Finally, when you see the face again, you compare your internal representation to that representation and then decide what decision you're going to make. Yes, it was one I was remembering, or no, it was not. In addition to looking at the brain to figure out how information is maintained in working memory, we can also understand better the nature of how information is maintained by changing the demands. So here I only have one face, but to make this process more engaged, I could increase it to two faces. So here's an example where it would be the same thing. You'd see not one item, but two items on the screen, and you're maintaining both of those in your mind. Finally, you'd see a single test item, and you decide was this face either of the two that I was maintaining? What we find here in brain imaging studies is that there's actually more activity in face regions, parts of the visual cortex that are processing faces, the more faces you're actually holding in your mind. Now, I'm giving this example of faces, but this could be any number of items. You could have shapes, colors, shoes, as I'll show you in a minute, as different kinds of stimuli that you might hold in your mind. Now, in addition to just maintaining this information, any time we are holding information in mind, at some level we must protect our mind from other sources of distraction. In this case, the distraction that I'm interested in examining is from external sources. Of course, we have a lot of internal distraction also. This wouldn't be the appropriate experiment to examine that. But in the context of holding information in mind and then having external distraction, we might learn something about how we're able to really hold that information in a stable, protected way so that we can later determine if it was one of the items we were holding in mind. So in the context of this experiment, what we did is we actually distracted them. We had them either, on the top row you'll see in some conditions we had them remember just one face, and then again they'd get a test face at the end. And instead of having a blank period of time, we presented them with distractors. And those distractors could be either very similar to the items that they were remembering, like the faces at the bottom, or they could be items that really aren't going to compete with the items you're holding in your mind. So, for example, shoes. And what we know from many studies that have been done on this is that both the amount of information that you're holding in your mind and the nature of the distraction impacts your performance. So if I'm asking you to remember only one face and then I don't distract you and test your memory, it's very good relative to if I asked you to remember two faces, relative to if I asked you to remember a face and distracted you, or if I really wanted to make this difficult, I would ask you to remember two faces and then distract you with faces, right? So all of these are just ways in which we can experimentally determine how training might be beneficial. Is it in the nature of holding the information, or is it protection from distraction? Or is it a combination of both? So that's what I would like to tell you about next. How is it that how is it that working memory might actually be improved, if at all, with mindfulness training in younger adults and older adults who we know have difficulty with this? So this is just showing you how people would typically perform in this task. And what we see is that if you're remembering two faces and there's a face distraction, your performance is quite bad. Your accuracy is around 80%. It's not terrible, but it's not very good. If you look at on the other end, where you only have one face and a shoe that's the distractor. Oh, sorry. Okay. Is that better? You find that performance is quite good. So you're able to hold the information in mind, and because it's only one item, and then when the shoe appears, your performance is not that problematic. So what's interesting...
It's tougher for the mind, tougher for the thoughts to hold all of that, yeah.
To hold it as it's being challenged.
Yeah.
That's right. But what's useful about this experiment is that it gives us a good way to see how behavior changes as we change the demands. So there's a lot more room to see how training might benefit it. The other thing that's important to notice is that these effects of how much information two faces...
So here one type of meditation that may be of interest to experiment on is the Vajrayana.
나 컨트롤이 진짜 양용이 되는 지 때문에 이ner다. 해지 투지를 해줬으면 좋겠어. 내 열이 해야 말씀.
So is the Vajrayana meditation on deity yoga that involves visualization, and in this it's in the context of what is called the generation stage, and there's a meditation where the yogi begins with a very particular aspect of the face of the deity. For example, simply, paying the focus on the wisdom eye. And then as that visualization image becomes clearer, then it starts slowly adding up onto the face like, an artist. Yeah, while holding the object that you have used earlier and then building up on it. So then you start gradually having the whole face, and then the whole body, and then the whole mandala in which the deity sits. And all of this is supposed to be happening at the level of thought, while keeping this image. So So His Holiness would speculate and that hypothesize that if you find a yogi who has quite an advanced level of this kind of skill, if they are exposed to this kind of experiment, probably they will be able to perform as fast as whether there are two faces or one face. So this is something for the future.
Absolutely. That's the thing.
So this is something that you can experiment on once a yogi who has this kind of realization has been born.
Yes.
One of the benefits of having a design like this is that we can accommodate people with incredible skill levels, because we could not only add how many faces they would be asked to remember, but also distract them more and more and more to see what their limits might actually be. So it may not be that they're... So until that type of subject arrives in my laboratory, the subjects that we've tested on this have been young adults that take this experiment, and what we find is that actually there is a benefit of taking this 8-week course. And the specific benefit is that their ability to maintain information is improved, and their protection from these distractors is actually also improved. The other part of this graph that I think is kind of interesting is that these two aspects, how much information you're asked to remember and protecting yourself from distraction, at some level are additive.
What do you mean by that?
That it's not that if I just looked at the amount of benefit I get the amount of costs I get for a really distracting face versus a shoe, it's the same amount for two faces or one face that I'm remembering. These two lines are parallel to each other. And that's important because now we can start, it'll be important in a minute when I tell you what happens as we age. So anyway, what I'm describing here is just now looking at the impact of how much information you're asked to remember, two faces or one face. And this is after they've received the training. You'll see in the easy condition, one face, the two lines are the same. Black is training, blue is no training, they're the same. But in the two-face condition, you'll notice that the black box is greater.
Yeah, that's true.
So, and in an
Yes.
패지 증원이 아주 리그도도 안다. 신의 그도도 증원이 받으시라 되게 쉐이크도 하고. 지금도 자리에 있는 패지 아주 증원은 괜찮고 지야 돼.
네.
좀 충분히 매나.
네.
그게 미국 먹고 샤인도 자네.
네.
그게 샤르면 하고.
So this makes sense, and from the Buddhist kind of point of view, here one would expect that it is the reason why, particularly in the Vajrayana meditation context, mental laxity is thought to be a really a very critical kind of obstacle that one must overcome.
그도 간데 시작할 진을 가봐 봐도 주고
지금 정말 정말
당장 그냥 정말로 다 정말 참무스네 다 정말 시스템 그게 세천
나름
다 시스템 그게 통도이 되면 콜부죠
나름
개발의 정화단 거가 니가요.
대대대 저한테 안 진을 봐도 주는 리시도 와
나름
안데 디크도를 샤야 디기 그도 된 저하면서 그 무슨 소리 마도
나름
미국 몽골이야 똑배 때인도잖아요. 진의 배지 받주는 거죠.
So for example, if you look at the instructional 나름
중독의 유협을 개침부를 있었어야 돼.
So if you look at the texts on shamatha practice, two main obstacles are identified: mental laxity and excitation. And the mental laxity is understood to really come in the way of maintaining and cultivating kind of vividness and clarity of the mind, and which also touches upon ensuring that the state of your mind is very alert. And although in the shamatha context, the main aim is to cultivate a single pointedness on a chosen object so that you don't have a multiplicity of objects. However, if you take that instruction and apply it in the context of Vajrayana, Deity Yoga, meditation, then you can understand, because there is a much more complex object of meditation, multiplicity, and all simultaneously, which requires a tremendously, very alert and vivid state of mind to be able to hold all of these, different complex object of meditation. So His Holiness feels that this makes sense, that with training one gets better there.
In that context, the vividness really refers to high resolution, high resolution like HD.
That's right. So my prediction would be in the next experiment that we might do, if we were actually looking at the brain when nothing was on the screen, and we were actually looking at these face-sensitive regions, we might find greater activity in those regions in people that have been practicing versus those that have not. That would be one way to index this vividness, right? So the next thing that we wanted to see is what happens with the distraction. And what we find there is that there's benefits for both types of distraction. There's not a greater benefit when it's more distracting. It's any type of distraction is benefited. And this is just showing you the same thing, that in the high number of faces condition, remember too, the red line, which is after training, is higher than the black line. When the task is easy, we don't see much difference. So it seems to be the case that both the ability to maintain the information is improved and the protection against distraction is improved.
트레이닝 셰셔브디기 샘미벌이야 네베 내쳐 거로 요되네 칭월이야 다나 동아 맞으버셨네 샘비게 진 대버지 내쳐 거로 대도 용구로다 서릭지기 내쳐 다나 대모투네 그 칭의 꽤 매버진도 로 셀드네지
네
트레이닝
So this may be, His Holiness was saying that if he may, one suggestion he would like to make, or at least like to see, is that among those who receive trainings, there will be individual differences. And if you look at the Buddhist understanding of the qualities of a meditative mental state, we talk about, for example, in the Indian tradition, say, for example, in relation to single-pointedness cultivation or shamatha, two main qualities that are being cultivated are stability on the one side, focused, sustained focus and stability, and then the vividness and the clarity on the other. So, and they correlate to the two main obstacles. One is mental excitation, which comes in the way of maintaining the stability, and one is mental laxity, which impedes the cultivation of the vividness, maintenance of the vividness. So again, of course, we need to bear in mind that when we talk about these obstacles, there are different levels. You can have a coarse level of these obstacles, subtle and very subtle levels of these obstacles. So imagine among the individuals who receive this training, due to whatever differences, some individuals may have much greater capacity for maintaining the stability, yet has less alertness and vividness. And then some individuals may not have this greater capacity for stability, but at the same time they have this very alert, kind of acute, kind of vivid quality. So is there a way of teasing that out in your experiments? So His Holiness, so within these people who receive training, His Holiness would hypothesize that those, although may have good stability but have less vividness and clarity, they might not be able to perform well when there are two phases, multiple phases. And those who, instead of greater stability but has greater vividness and alert mind, they might be able to perform better when there are complexities thrown in.
So she was the training chess with meaty. That kind of thing you know. That is a cover. That kind of name could chingo shoot you. That did on the dogs, Chingshe Shukshambo, you think did take Tarjo. Those Nidus and Chingshe Shukshamra, Mengem Mistuna, or the Koji Tarjuna.
So, as you do this experiment, one suggestion would be that you can be a bit more kind of discriminating. You can be a bit more discriminating and try to see among the trained subjects, people who have received training, to see whether someone hasn't paid that much attention to the cultivation of vividness as opposed to stability. And that, of course, you have to base to some extent on the self-report by asking questions. And then once you have a sense of these differences, then you might want to expose them to the experiments.
I think that that level of precision would be fantastic. And this is where maybe we're talking about the real differences between novices and experienced practitioners. The strategy that I was considering to answer a question like that wouldn't be so much to look at individual differences in the context of these new and very novice practitioners, because it would be difficult for them to tell the difference.
I think Solon says it's possible, even in the context of someone receiving 8 weeks of training.
I mean,
when you start meditating, you can kind of experientially, to some extent, distinguish between a form of stability that has, laxity, and form of stability that is, freer from, laxity. So let alone 8 weeks, it's only saying that in his case, he doesn't even have 1 day training in this kind of mindfulness. However, if he starts observing the mind, he can see the
Even if it's
distinction.
few minutes, few seconds.
So you can distinguish between excitation and laxity to start with.
지상년에 친구도 그배 가서 과야고 차.
네.
right? In Korean, the training 싱에 미디 트레이닝 시스템 미디잉을 고개지지는 그 지원식셔도 지원식총도 여치도
So
디네디 대비는 싱글.
So as the experimenter, you need to first of all have to be able to understand the differences between these two obstacles, excitation and laxity, so that you have a better appreciation of the concepts. And then based on that, you can start developing self-report questions to find out whether someone is more prone to excitation or, more prone to laxity. And then on that basis, then you can do the experiments.
Right. I'd like to just comment on that. There's no doubt that I need to learn more about the practices. So, but one strategy that we've taken is to have other experiments that really tap into this ability to sustain your attention, which would, I think, be better able to index, may allow us a different window onto which subjects are good at stability versus those that may not be.
가서 트레이닝 제시해 봐. 트레이닝 제시 미디
So His Holiness would hypothesize that when you bring these subjects to experiments, whether you perform the same experiments when they were hungry and when they were full, he would expect there will be differences in the performance. Because when you are full, there's a greater proneness to laxity, mental laxity.
We've actually done that experiment.
Morning, evening,
and also whether you do it in the morning or in the evening.
Yeah.
So you did that?
Yeah, we did that with. We actually gave them an experiment that was like the flanker experiment. We had words, and they had to detect the color of the words. The words were food words, and they were either very tasty, high-calorie foods, or not at all. And we gave them the task, and everybody showed that they were slower at detecting the color when the foods were high-calorie versus low-calorie.
That's
different, but it gets at the idea.
Kalade shak to chimbo jigo chimbo ri kai ma de lonye de karsine
lonye senge de
mar da sayo mar da kala sewe ke mare da 이게 비게 문제 제거로 이게 디 칙 문제 다디 천정 문제 제스라 다 칙들이야 아니 천정 담을 때제 다 칙데 아니 칼라게 칙데 칼라지고 샥스 chimbo de 칙다 샥스 시다 메드니 칼라 규메 칙데 제거 샥스 chimbo 칙디게들이야 내가 제고 두가라 네 가르치는 테스트 해봐다 신기해 주제여서 그렇지
디인시지 미견이 지고 삼담이나 내가 수셔야
That could be true if, for example, in the meditation, in the Buddhist text, it says that when you take an object of your meditation, which is kind of solid and heavy, that can help maintain a greater stability.
The more light 샤위나 가서 왜냐면 차를 샤위나 정수총
So, for example, if you have an object that is light, and also light in the kind of a texture sense, then also in the brilliant sense, that can reduce proneness to mental laxity. That's quite interesting. Am I right in understanding that what they have to do is to detect the color?
Yes.
But the words describing the food are very greasy, heavy food versus just ordinary other food.
Cake or carrot.
Any pleasure daily casual, vegetarian, non-vegetarian casual.
So His Holiness was saying there might be also slightly differences between people who are vegetarian versus non-vegetarian.
I think generally vegetarian better.
More alert, more alert. Same sage yagaruje.
패즈 수구 양을 쳐거로다. 누구지 양 쳐도.
So it's partly a function of the lightness of the body. you feel in the body. So vegetarians generally make you feel lighter.
그래. 특히 vegetarian 저까지 저거 배 루데도 좋아요.
But however, there are some vegetarians whose belly is already bulging.
Oh yes.
Just to finish up with that, just to finish up with the food experiment, I know that takes us off track, but I just wanted to mention that the slowness of the high-calorie food decreased after we fed them. And after 8 weeks of training, when they came in, they had a reduction. So it's consistent with the idea. But my bigger point is just that I absolutely agree that there's more ways in which we can tap into these two features. In addition to the methods that you described of probing the subject's own state and awareness of their laxity and stability, we might think about designing training that emphasizes only one aspect or another to see if we can see specific differences in our pattern of results. It's another strategy. So the last
기름기는 산나고 배고도리야. 그게 믿고 세워야 돼. 저 강선 다 가서 꼭 강선에 저 세워야 배수 처리 했어. 그래서 프레젠티브 그도 신내고 배고도리야. 그럼 믿긴 니체 대점 중심으로 다가 될 수 있어야지. 들으시던다. 통중. 그래. 들으시도가 중앙 요래. 너는 좀 나이는 지나 요래. 자, 뒤좀전 합을 수 신문도. 또 더리게 되게 배지 때문에 섭취해서. 배지래죠.
Solens was saying that he has read in one of the texts that contrasting the shamatha practice in the context of sutra, kind of mainstream general Buddhism versus in the Vajrayana context when one is cultivating this visualization. The text says that in the general context of shamatha, then the cultivation of the vividness in relation to a single chosen object is okay. So that's the goal. Whereas in the Vajrayana context of visualization, then the vividness has to be applied to the object from all sorts of different angles, from a multiplicity of angles. So His Holiness has often wondered why that is the case. So today he feels that some light has been shed on this.
So thank you.
So the last thing I'd like to share with you, Your Holiness, is a study that we've been doing in older adults. And the question that we asked is, well, we had two questions. Does working memory get worse or degrade with age? Now, Adele showed us these beautiful images this morning of the frontal lobes developing through the course of child development, and that they don't fully develop till we're in about our mid-20s. Well, the bad news is that they're also the first to start degrading as we age. And so we would predict, and many have shown, that it is the case that our working memory performance gets worse as we get older. The question I had was, if we know this is happening, is there a way in which mindfulness training, which seems to have these beneficial effects in young adults, might actually be protective in older adults? And if so, we would expect that perhaps with practice, the rate of decay or decline in older adults might be reduced. So the first question was just, if we compare the younger and older subjects on this exact experiment, do we get the effects that people have previously found, which is worse performance? And that's what I'm showing here. The dotted line is younger adults, and the red line is older adults. And what we see is that their biggest difficulty is when they have to maintain more information in the presence of more distraction. So it's not that they're just worse overall. It's specifically when there's a challenge as you're holding the information.
로게 난 도도도스 나 고치 로나로 냐토모도 게 지보레민도스 다 냐야 망부냐다 아니 되네 데 라멘타야.
So we have these older and younger adults, and only the older adults receive the training in this case. And we have control subjects who don't receive training that are younger adults or that are older adults. And what I'm showing on the next slide, so the answer is yes. What I'm showing on this slide is a comparison between the older adults who received training, who are again in red, and the older adults matched in age who did not receive training. And what we find is their performance is maintained, whereas the older adults with training improved. And so this positive result, in a way, it's very interesting to think about if it is the case that mindfulness training can be protective against aging. And this last graph is just showing the mindfulness training group, the older adults, compared to younger adults with no training. This
그래 근데 부셔버 되게 트레이닝 해보자. 로셔버 되게. gembazola training te no kunyin dorje. So what does the graph suggest?
The red lines are the red
so
line.
The young adults are still better.
The red line is the same here as here. In this case, the dotted line is older adults who received no training, so they're the same age as the people in the red line. Okay, no training. Mm-hmm. Here, it's younger adults who received no training.
They are the dotted line.
And they're the dotted line.
But they're still higher.
The younger adults that receive no training are statistically comparable to the older adults with training. So the question you might ask is, what about the younger adults who receive training? And as I showed you previously, they get even better than this level.
Yes.
So the kind of view what we might have is to think about mindfulness training as being somewhat effective in protecting us in this aging process. And in a sense, these older adults' performance looks younger. So the answer to both questions is yes, that we can improve working memory in older adults. And I just want to end by bringing up this definition that Alan described and that Rupert discussed, to say we might, through this conversation between cognitive neuroscientists studying attention and Buddhist scholars, start getting a handle on what these concepts, how these concepts might map onto each other. Is it the case that Manasikara is something like orienting, turning the mind toward? Is it the case that smriti, without thinking about the ethical and wholesome qualities, may be similar to working memory, in the sense that it's about remembering in the short term, calling to mind, taking a hold and not losing the object? So just to bring us back to the conclusions, what I've tried to share with you is some of the studies that we've been doing to explore the relationship between mindfulness training and these aspects of attention that we know a lot about. And so far it seems to be that there are many positive results that we find there are benefits of this type of training, even in folks that are, even in individuals that are learning with very brief training for the first time. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Me?
Yes, if you have some questions, I'm sure you have plenty of questions, but maybe His Holiness has already been adding a lot of information from the Buddhist side, and I think that's why I let a little bit of more time, because that was really extremely interesting. Do you have a question that would even bring more?
One of the things that I didn't get to tell you about today, Your Holiness, is another set of studies that we've been doing in which we are investigating these working memory processes, and at the same time looking to see how mood or emotional experience might be changing. And what we're finding is that it's not, when we compare groups of people that have all received training, and we look to see how much their improvement in working memory relates to how much time they spent practicing, we find a nice relationship. the more they practiced, the better their working memory got. And these aren't long periods of time. The maximum was something like 12 hours over 8 weeks as the total time. At the same time, we're finding that there are improvements in positive mood and negative mood. And if we statistically try to understand the relationship between working memory and mood, we find that they are related to each other. So it seems to be the case that the greater the capacity, the more reduction in negative mood. So my question to you is, in thinking about these processes of mental control, of attention, are the views that these capacities are used in the service of multiple types of contexts, or is it that there's a different kind of capacity that's brought to emotional experience?
그래. 간식이 들으시는데 예를 제바다 전바다 되게 기주되게 되어 봐. 되게 나는 남병원에 제베나 고 대망부질이야. 내가 망부질이야. 고 땐돈이 기주다 연대를 주문데 지겨래. 양코란 배 전바다 이제단 되게 대한 코란 그런 게 시질로마도 현달이야. 애플라지 맵다 봐. 근데 관심한 거나서 그다음 그런 뭐라 세베나 저는 working memory 여러 침배 경기 아니 묘몬 당진지 또 묘몬서 그다가 전용 다 그다 내 당진지야 편도 유지 도 연구도스 대디는 남병원은 대변나 단다 템바다 대 이집은 주디 고얀 대망부지리야 근데 지 emotionally 제가 여대 버지래 당진지야 단 동심지야 들리 묘단 슈충단 들리야 제가 유니지래 제가 매니지래
现在什么说 한자 가지고 네 지금 샘 중 남샤지 셔야지 그래 신의 주시게 얼마다 아들 남들은 가게 시고
되다 말이다 이는 뭐라 근데 셔야되리샤 디 묘모 당진지야다 간다 소뇽 네베르 징 소뇽 당진지야다 들리야
다 디치도 미국이네
다
팬도
Of course, Isolans was saying that when bringing in the Buddhist perspective on these mental faculties, the context in which
자야지 가서 그래. 더 출룩 잡아요, 그래. 타버 된 얘기도 장인도 전에 야 그것이 다시 강조되고 다 맨날 시랑 남아 이제 항도 검야가 전달이야. 대디 체인지는 그래 안 된다면 참. 야, 대대기 지 심하게 지게 매체 저 다른 심지가 그 별로리가 즉 잡았어야 돼. 더 장고 있는 거고. 내가 말을
So these are kind of, I mean, these are essentially faculties. Once they are developed, they can be applied in many different domains. And to what kind of domain it is applied is very much dependent upon the intention and the motivation of the person. So you could imagine in the Buddhist context, someone whose main aspiration is to seek enlightenment would cultivate these qualities and apply these qualities, directed towards that goal. And then you could also have practitioners, who will cultivate these qualities, but whose main aspiration is to attain more fortunate or favorable rebirth. But then you could also imagine people whose, kind of worldview is, this lifetime, and would want to attain, greater peace of mind and, happier mental states and so on. One can cultivate these qualities and apply these, faculties directed towards that aim. So it's really up to the domain to which the motivation of the individual person leads to.
이제 디지털 용서래. 신의 공부의 지기 묘목 범위체도 신의 공부 많아야. 그래 신의 심 지지게 누구로 그제야 철 침배 쪽이 되는 라고디디 더 시다 가서 그래. 인액티브 차대.
So in the case of shamatha practice, even though the person who is cultivating shamatha may not be motivated to do this towards attainment of liberation and towards overcoming of the afflictions, the kleshas, but as a result of cultivating shamatha and attaining it, it is, the case that it will be the case that there will be a significant reduction in many of the manifest levels of afflictions, like attachment to the sensual objects and so on.
나도 이 어비다마 나야 뒤송도가 감숨 트리가
Three realms, three dhatus.
다들이 가서 이제 찾아.
Devakamlam.
뉴몬이야. 되게 뉴몬. 수지세되게 뉴몬. 나도 시도.
So in Abhidhamma, for example, there's a discussion of the three realms, the desire realm, the form realm, and the formless realm. And corresponding to these different realms, there are also different afflictions. In afflictions that belong to the desire realm, that is associated with the form realm and formless realms, and so on.
자상하다. 그런데 배는 되심겨 지지고 되베서도 들어봐다. 되베서도 이제 이내 디 용어께 있는 자네 배지 되는 작방문지 어디서 또 수술을 해. 무슨 냉을 때는 가서 장로 송티.
You want to explain that?
You're going to continue.
So, for example, when you attain a single-pointedness of the mind for the practitioner, although within this schema of the three realms, it may belong to the desire realm, but the fact that a high level of single-pointedness has been attained, as a byproduct, there will be a reduction in the arising of more manifest levels of afflictions like attachment to the sensual objects and so on.
Well, I have to follow up with this. I know you don't want me to, but this is something that, Your Holiness, is something that I have been very conflicted about. Because these results that I just described to you come from a group of people that were Marines, soldiers, before they went to Iraq. And I can say a lot about our intention for bringing these practices to them. They're suffering immensely. They're coming back. They've got trauma. They're dealing with contexts that require a great amount of attention so they don't make missteps and cause more harm. And they're coming back very damaged, causing them a lot of harm in terms of domestic violence, community violence. That was the intention with which we brought these practices to them. They did benefit. They improved their working memory, and they reduced their negative affect. Based on what you just said, it seems to me that there's a trust in these practices, assuming they're taught properly, that is corrective, that the qualities that might be developed could lead to greater good. But I wanted to really talk to you about this. I don't think it's a simple issue, and I don't want to derail our discussion, but I'm in the very fortunate position where, in the context of many scientists that might do something that leads them to feeling that their science might be used for good or evil. I'm in a very fortunate position to have my science intersect with your interest. So I'd like to ask you for your advice.
Zero. I appreciate your work. That's all.
Matthew?
I may try to offer something. First of all, from what His Holiness was mentioning about the complex visualization, having a different way of treating the obstacles of excitement and laxity, it's very difficult to use excitement on one-pointed single object because it's basically a major obstacle. But in the case of complex visualization, there's a possibility of channeling a very active mind because of the complexity of the object itself. So if your mind is very active, you can just make it very busy looking at all the details. Mm-hmm. So in a way, there is a possibility of using that very hyperactive mind to increase and vivid visualization. While laxity is a loser because everything dims and you don't see how you could use it. So now, as an indication of what you were saying, how
미국 소설로 삼다 안 액투스.
말도 안 돼.
미국 몽골로. 레레도 소설로 삼다. 대만에.
그래서 샘 고보 다 칭화여라 봐. 샘 고보 인다.
고보 쇼침보여나.
제대로.
미과 몽보 요디 값수. 예때스 샘 고보 딜레테스 땅초로 봐.
대만에.
됐네.
안데 두스 말다. 안데 고미야디. 기름 고백 그돌이야. 냐라 곰제 미국 담을 입었지. 냐라 투중 시에바체. 미슈 관백하도리야 미버리 주고 누가 말다 내가 토마 미버 찍 땅장이야 로장니 미버 때라 가사디민 주선네 랭통게 참아 릭규에 번라고 통주에 번라고 지금 랭통게 참아 담분이소나 티 마야레 토네 다 애니 미버 신다지 다양 사야 탑시체 미버 찍고도 마야레 토네 티 건배 커돌이야 미버디 누가 말다 건배 커돌이야 캔이 대대버디마도 초아키는 용 파도 가서 미버 신다를 보고야 말해 그래서 딱 가르치고 있으려면 미버 찍了 랭동 참아 땀부 주면서 하면 뒤토라 찍는 배죠 다 제일 정도 사람이니부터 또 전이 그 로찌기 조금 로찌고 찍니라 봐 그걸 다들 되게 쓰다들이 미버 망스 샤야지 다들 나기 아니 기름 거면 그도는 뒤세도 되는 공고래스 바로 집에 대박으로 있는 미버 찍는 미니 들로 하는 샤 정도 다른 집이죠.
Alan, you want to bring that out? To clarify the approach of this more complex form of shamatha meditation in the Vajrayana context, it's not a question of shifting attention to different objects within the focus, field of one's focus, but rather maintaining this single-pointedness upon a chosen object, initially a simple object, and then up to a point where, as the text describes, the objects become so real as if you could touch it and feel it. You could see it or touch it. So once you have attained that level of stability and vividness of the object, then you add different features and you build up. So you don't shift the focus, but you just, and while maintaining the earlier object, somewhat analogous to a painter who paints an eye and then starts filling up the face and the rest of the body. So you maintain your focus on the earlier object, but then you add on to it and then slowly building up into a So the aim is that at a certain point you are able to maintain the image of the entire mandala, both the person himself, the meditator, and the environment in which the person has been visualized within a single mental state.
Matthew, you want to follow up?
The second aspect of the question, how the mindfulness can help well-being and positive moods. And I think there's a clear link in the sense that negative moods come from automatic, unconscious chain reaction. One thought leads to many that invades your mind and create that afflictive emotion. So mindfulness, in the sense that you might be more aware of the coming of these thoughts, and therefore when they are still weak, being able to let them dissolve. There's a clear connection between mindfulness and not falling into the habit of destructive emotions.
Yeah, Cliff? You wanted to say? Sorry.
The brain specialist. They are the team. But a Michigi. Turns a chiggler. The Dukes and some down the chiggy. Kadugi, Lebe, Rodantida, the holistic to stab a Kadugi, Lebanese Chavakadua.
The case of this coming, So this may be partly relevant or not, but one thing that Solens was saying that he would be interested to hear from the neuroscientist particularly is whether there are any differences in the brain level expressions of someone, say, who's paying attention to a very selective single focus or kind of a more distributed focus, like kind of a global. And you want to take up...
Please.
I think there are some differences. I mean, usually when you're doing a global task, there's more activity on the right side, and when you're doing a focused task, there's more activity on the left. So that's one finding.
레벨 대전 찍는 거 주지도.
So given this, there is a difference between more focused versus more distributed, even at the level of brain expression. So when a very strong kind of, destructive emotion like kind of, say, anger or aversion arises,
or attachment.
Strong, attachment arises.
So usually, according to our experience, of course, everybody have this full experience. So when we develop anger or attachment, then that mind is really focusing one single target. That absolute, independent, that kind of sort of feeling. So therefore, the mindfulness, these things bring more complexity.
Yeah.
So therefore, nature, by nature, right, single point to one target, right, independence, absolute. That and the more holistic sort of view, more using complex of the whole brain. There's contradiction. So although it's not aiming to reduce these negative emotion or destructive emotion, but the very way of looking different. Therefore, the more complex sort of mental
states,
mental state is developed. Then this single point, it's
more like kind of targeted.
That automatically reduce.
It would be interesting to look at the brain when you're in these different states to see whether they do.
Interesting. That diameters. And then diameters.
Cliff, you have something to say to
so
that?
They are the diameters. Dumbezik. Dumbezik want to cube Kadula, Lava Karsiktua. Nishi Dengegi. Shiruki, no so tembe, Lotte Kadu, Longo Kadula, Lava Karsiktua. This tower.
So another distinction that needs to be explored and studied at the brain level is between two primarily different states of mind. One is more effectively oriented, which takes the form of, for example, like an aspiration, yearning, and so on. Then there is the other, which is more cognitively oriented, which may involve more of use of an intelligence, reasoning. And so at the brain level, it would be interesting to see how they're expressed differently.
Liz would probably be able to say more on that.
Yeah, thank you.
I mean, we will talk about this some tomorrow, but I think it's actually a very complex interaction. So it's not the case that there's sort of one emotional brain and one cognitive brain. They actually interact at almost every level of analyses. It is the case that sometimes our choices are driven more by our affect and other times more by our reason. And we can certainly have control over that. So we can use executive functions to diminish our emotional responses and come with a different solution to a problem. But it's not so discrete as to say that there's one way of one thing driving a choice, which is emotion, or another thing, which is a reason. Because of course, one of the primary functions of emotion is to help give something value, to let you know the right choice to make. So that's actually an important part of your reasoning process, to consider that as well.
Emotion emotion cognitive emotion decision reason decision decision so emotion chindo reason chindo emotion mandro yan namjo zo pejo cheje yan domsem cheje emotion di emotion de chidaya miso namjo pejo tangbegi 차시 공 주고 요래서 간는 수술이야. 뇌마다 되게 돈에 소화지 되게 그래서 나온. 맛이 사니까 연구해 줬어.
If may, Yeah, short.
This is a different topic. Your Holiness, your comments for suggestions to look at individual differences in laxity or excitation was of great interest to those of us doing this kind of work. One issue is how to operationalize that, how to do that practically. Do you know of behavioral signs of laxity and excitation?
그건 experiment design 책으로 봐. design 책다는 펜트럴. 그 친구다 친구는 그분이 보대. 류고 남주 영화가 남주고도.
How do you tell?
임지 당토에 여러베스.
그래서 샤요.
그래서 다 그게 시단다는데.
다 유르부 지도 시베 있는 직진 샤 여러메로. 침도 다 쓰는 거 들으시 샤도 와.
네.
전부 다 샤 메리. 있는데 친구 숙체를
로뇽만
하고 메로. 가고래. 가.
So it's also saying that unless you go to know someone.
다지다르시 샤빈데 미 중국도 자리 거식 샤리. 미 철저도 자리 중국식 샤야. 지다샤는 봐. 다 있는 딩이 와케 말하다.
So unless you are willing to spend quite a lot of time to get to know someone, it'll be very difficult to kind of guess. Of course, in the text there are.
그래서 지면줄 보고 셔도 와. 그래서 미쳐서 보고 더 좋아. 그래서 보고 셔도 중국식 셔고, 그 교류식 셔도 중국식 셔고.
So, but there are, for example, related to this, there's a whole question of how do you infer the different mental states of a being and qualities of a being. In the Buddhist text, there are kind of proofs, behavioral proofs, signs that are indicated. For example, some of them are referred to as the irreversible signs and so on. But in the case of laxity and excitation, generally, the understanding is that people who are kind of fast thinking, very sharp, they are more prone to excitation. And people who are kind of a little bit slower and duller tend to be more prone to mental laxity. And the reason for that is because mental laxity is understood to be a product of mukpa, like torpor, dullness, mental dullness. So and those who are kind of slower and duller are thought to be more prone to mental laxity. But that's the general understanding, but that doesn't apply.
루리 배경송 들어가지 야래.
You want to make
that?
Yeah.
Also, in terms of traditional Tibetan medicine, which is the same as Ayurvedic, there are the three so-called humors of wind, bile, and phlegm. And the person who is prominent in phlegm tends to be perhaps a little bit chubby, round edges, slow-moving, more patient. That person, being of earth and water element, is probably going to be more prone to laxity and dullness. A person who is more of the fire, red face, sharp-tempered, that kind of person more likely to be prone to excitation, and likewise for wind. Did I say something?
Jimpala was...
And likewise for the wind. Because I wouldn't know about the reference of this myself. And wind
You're
people tend to be
about us, right?
wind people tend to be very light and quickly moving, very fast in all respects, and they of course also would be going more towards the excitation, not so much the dullness of it.
Cliff, I would like to leave it at that because we have another topic that is very central to this whole discussion, and it's the whole idea about this distinction when something is conceptual and when something is perception. So the distinction between conceptual and perception. And I would like to invite Sean to make a Western philosophical input into that and maybe then elicit a few questions in that direction.
Okay. So in Western philosophy, there is a debate between one side, which claims that all perception is already conceptual, has conceptual elements in it. And another side.
제베르스는 지기 도미지 여러.
요 말이 근데 도지 도바라래.
And on the other side, it's a claim that there is in perception the possibility of a perception that is non-conceptual. And so on the side of the non-conceptual, the argument is that conceptual knowledge always involves language. But of course, on the other side, the claim is conceptual knowledge does not necessarily involve language. And it's about drawing the map of the mind, as we heard about yesterday. Is there a way to draw a line between perception or some kind of non-conceptual experience on the one side and more conceptual experience? Is the line to be drawn with language, or is there some other way to define the differences or to deny the differences? That's the philosophical controversy. And that's the question.
아니 조질이야 다 쉐바 인제 좀 똑바 인고 말이 그래서 똑바 인발라 아니 다다는 건 데버고레스 다든 다이 데벌레디고 안 다단 데버 메디니 그 쉐베르든 용초고레스 지라 고레스 다 바나모디 시게시 디기 똑바 인제 좀 쉐바 인제 좀 똑바 인고 스니디기 똑바 인발 인지미 달을 되고요 말해서 고레스 인제 야마 참제제디
I can add that in developmental psychology also, this is a discussion. So some developmental psychologists will claim that even very young infants have conceptual knowledge, and others will deny that. They will say young infants will have experiences, perceptions that are not yet conceptual because they do not yet have language.
다들 보고 참은 제바치니 사이콜로지스 나올래 단 저버도 요레스 그래서 부춘주만 장가리야 또 봐요 말이야
맞아요.
맞아요.
And I think there's a difference of opinion among the experts here.
다간다 림버브데 티그르도 가wanja고 이면 요레스 지금지 봐도 무슨 제 지금지 봐도 또 진되네 또 버렸어야지. Even in ancient India, among the philosophers, between the Buddhist and the non-Buddhist, and among the non-Buddhist, there's been a lot of debate on whether the sensory perceptions are through and through conceptual or not. But in principle, if we don't make the distinctions between perceptual versus conceptual, it really opens up a lot of problems.
나는 냠냠 통도 유주전신 만디비체니 그걸 다다 통되는지 누가 개발자 통해 소셜 누가 돼 다지나네 도배 직야 첸 샤세요거네 다직 투시 이거 사실 도산 사업주도
So even from our own personal experience phenomenologically there seems to be a difference in the way in which we experience the world. So, for example, there could be a very, kind of primary experience of a given object where there is no conflation of time and space. What is given is perceived. And then when you are at the level of...
eye consciousness, I can see it from here up to from here.
But the mind cannot, the conceptual thought cannot kind of ascertain, all the facts that are within that field, whereas the visual perception is able to really attend to all of these. So, and also at that level of experience, no evaluative judgments are made of whether good or bad or any of that. So then this is followed by a conceptual thought processes, which then selects out of these field of whatever's within the field of experience, it selects whatever it chooses to, and then starts labeling and also attributing qualities of desirability or undesirability, good or bad, and so on.
진짜 도움이 원고 시험에 들어야지. 그 야할 당고 저는 원고 거를 야다 소지경 샤레 뭐 수주 샤레 먹고.
네.
류한도 수주 제대로 와. 다 안당 아주 트레이닝 제 이루도 봐도.
네. So if someone wants to try to improve their visual sights or auditory power and so on, the only way in which you can do that is to really do something about the physical basis of these organs. No amount of mental training is going to help you. Whereas when we talk about effects of mindfulness practices and so on, we're really talking at the level of thought, conceptual thought, where then it is much more susceptible to training and adaptations and so on.
Through training,
so where there are scope for improvement and perfections and so on, through meditation, this is really at the level of conceptual thought.
Emotions So
many of the emotions will also, when we talk about emotions, it will belong in that category of mental consciousness or mental cognition.
그걸 갈리갈리한 되는 지라고지가 아니야. 그래베 가서 그래. 굶지기도 하네. 영화로 사나운 표현에서는 그 유태를 너무 잘 모르고.
So, and then even though initially one may have a conceptual thought in relation to a particular object, but through constant familiarity and cultivation of that familiarity, it is conceivable that that thought may culminate into a more non-conceptual experience of that object.
가서 어디 가면 좋아. 쏘사지 가면 좋아. 그래서 시험에 장배 말이야.
장래 송한테 시험.
쏘 왕스도 왕부서 왕 걸어로 미완.
그런데서 류그 차시지다. 대단되어요. 배심그 차시지. 니고도 지그래서 그래서 샘디게 간다. alive 봐. alive 연구에 좀 센데 고 그냥 쏘고 왕부스지. 시험을 때 배심 쏘고.
가리마.
alive 봐. 고 쏘. 쏘신 분인자.
저사한테 가서 뭐 저런 다들 소원을 챙이 전화 시작하는 거서 딱딱 공부하라 딱딱으로 되고 공부를 잘해. 시험 말이야. 그 수시로 나와.
So yesterday Rupert, in your presentation, there was the discussion of the 7 omnipresent factors from the Theravada point of view, and one of which was the life force or life faculty, Jivindriya, so on. So in the Abhidhamma Kosha understanding, it's a physical faculty, and it's seen as the basis of warmth and life. Warmth and consciousness. So His Holiness is wondering whether you can explain a bit more why in the Theravada understanding it's been identified also as a mental factor.
Is that on? Yeah. I'm not sure that I really fully understand why. The simple idea seems to be it is also a physical factor in the Theravada Abhidhamma. So the suggestion is that consciousness also needs some kind of correlate to that. That consciousness is alive in some way, so it is animated. Part of the idea is that maybe the Jivatindriya is compared to the faculty of life at a conscious level is compared to a kind of water that sustains a lotus flower, so that consciousness uses almost a kind of life force. But that is, to some extent, a kind of guess on my part. It is not very clear.
Life force.
그 공부님이 말해.
그래 공부님이 있어. 공부실래. His Holiness is wondering whether there is some connection between, for example, in the Abhidhamma, there is a whole list of indriyas, faculties. And in fact, the sixth mental consciousness is thought to be also a faculty, a mental faculty.
원신 가운데 숙제 공부 지역체, 숙제 당할 공부 지역체. 다 이디 콜라 이완서 이완 가르쳐는 조금 대만 더 많아지게 돼 있어요.
For example, like for the five sensory, consciousness, there are the five sensory faculties which are their basis, and for the sixth mental consciousness, then what is the faculty? And the faculty is the mental faculty, and the mental faculty is identified as the immediately preceding mental state as the mental faculty. So His Holiness is wondering. So the term indriya or faculty has been applied to that. Yeah.
Yes. To jivita indriya.
저도 소 공부 시험 제가 시험을 주셔 저 가서 공부를 시험 리뷰스 주셔야 돼.
네. 그 자시럽지.
거의
그 야럽지.
그거 버리지도 그 정해지고 나는데.
So it seems that in that way of thinking, then the life faculty, the material correlate seems to have a partner in the mental domain. Yeah.
And did you want to make a statement to that, or?
Yeah, I think from the psychological perspective.
Yeah, it's on.
It's quite hard to make a dichotomy. It really depends what you mean by conceptual. For example, if what you mean is categorization, deciding that's a cat, that's a dog, then I think it's very hard to say that we become conscious at any stage without having that information available to awareness. The only way in which you might get that is if you're attending to something else. But provided that you're attending to, say, a picture of a cat, it's almost, it's impossible to access any percept without also the knowledge that it's a cat. Another problem from the psychological point of view is that the visual system is very complex. There are two different pathways, for example, one going through the dorsal route and one the ventral route, doing different things with different information, as I showed some examples yesterday. So, which one are we talking about when we try and draw a line?
then nujobe centri pe ngone shebe na kaisena da pena ri yemje ta ke shebe na ta telia ri yemje ben shimi je na shimi part ta ti shimi ngon zingi lo korang ke ko shimi da shimi mai bemje stang sarwa ta ko ri yemje ta categorization category pe che sa be shugo de 조지는 전에 또 벌레고 그게 besar지 다 pena shimi tome mi she de gi ko di shimire samsam mas면 shimi ngon zinje to 봐 시민군주 제도에 되게 시민다 시민 많이 라 그래 다들 될 똑바로서 라베나 아니 배제 원시 똑바 많이 봤잖아 샤카부로 샤스 그래서 달레버 고랑 돈에 제인도 갈배는 원시 자와체베 갑래 나는 봤어 뭐지 나는 여러 나래 나는 고주 명마다 마도 다 계속 배전 충성 통바까지 지리야 저도 통 내가 게만 나래 나래 다 가리 망해버디 가리 레버리는 이루 떠버들 말이야. No. So what would you in that case in Buddhist epistemology we speak about certain types of perceptual experiences where you perceive something but you're not able to ascertain it. So for example in the Tibetan epistemological texts there's a taxonomy of 7 mental states and one of which is referred to as a perception that perceives without being able to lead to any ascertainment. So I think the kind of examples that you gave yesterday.
When you're not attending, maybe that can happen. Otherwise, somebody used the example of listening to a foreign language. When I'm listening to you speaking in Tibetan, I can't categorize it, I can't understand it. But if you were speaking in English, I can't help understanding it. And the first level at which I become conscious includes the interpretation. If I'm listening to somebody else, if Mathieu were talking to me, then it would become, the English would become like Tibetan. I probably wouldn't consciously understand it, although my brain might distinguish that it was English rather than Tibetan.
Because the conceptual thoughts come very fast. So, so this opens up this whole question of how do we recognize category, how do we categorize. Again, this has been a major object of inquiry in the classical Indian philosophy. In fact, how do we recognize when we give a label to something, and how do we recognize that's the same label is applied to this particular animal or object which belongs to the same category. Some philosophers have been forced to therefore postulate something called some kind of universal that is independent of the particulars, that all the kind of universals, it's generic idea or universal that all the particulars participate in and somehow, instantiate this. And this is what, this permeates all the particulars. So therefore, whenever you see a particular that is different, you are able to immediately identify, to recognize it as being the same. So this has been a major area of inquiry.
It's also a big problem in psychology.
Thank you very much, Your Holiness, and we see you tomorrow again.